Today we'll be reading the second chapter of the Pagemaster, and so far Richard Tyler, our main character, has sought refuge from a storm inside the library. Unfortunately, he's now lost, and he's trying to find his way through. When we last left Richard, he was being helped by a pair of books named Fantasy and Adventure, and they had just narrowly escaped a few things, including a train named the Orient Express. Let's see what happens next. Horror. A full moon cast a gray light over an eerie graveyard. Chills ran up Richard's spine. He'd never been in a graveyard at night. He'd never been in a graveyard, period. Are we still in the library? Richard stammered. Aye, the horror section. Adventure drew his sword. It looks pretty scary. Richard's knees were shaking. That it does. Just stick close to me and you got nothing to worry about. Adventure stepped forward. Boy, do I feel safe now, Fantasy said sarcastically. Adventure's sword led the way through the graveyard. A blast of wind scattered a pile of dried leaves across the path, startling Richard. He jumped back into a pile of books, which weren't books at all, but bats. The swarm ignited into a frenzy, flapping and squeaking as they flew up into the air. Get away from me, you flying rats! Fantasy beat the bats back with her wand. As she turned around, Fantasy chuckled to herself when she spied Adventure cradled in Richard's arms. He looked exactly like a frightened baby. Adventure scrambled down. I was merely sleeping to the boy's protection, he explained. Uh-huh, Fantasy replied. And Sleeping Beauty was an insomniac. They continued on past a fog-layered gully and up a hill covered with old gravestones. There it is, Richard shouted. He was pointing toward the exit sign hovering up in the distant sky. Unfortunately, the sign was directly above a very scary-looking house. Probably haunted, Richard thought. Looks like the only way to reach the exit is through that there house. Adventure didn't look too happy either. No way am I going in there. Richard sounded as if he meant it. Fantasy looked around the tall, smooth cliffs that surrounded them. I'm afraid there's no other way out, she said. It's your only chance, boy. Adventure tried to persuade Richard. Come on, it's just a house. Just a house, Richard thought. Doesn't he know that 17% of all accidents happen in the house? Cautiously, they approached the old iron gate that fronted the property. The house was much bigger and scarier than Richard had thought. Tall windows stared out onto the porch, and a high tower rose from the center of the house. While Richard was staring at the spooky old mansion, Adventure pushed the gate open with his sword. It fell off its hinges and crashed to the ground. They kept on going, climbing the creaking stairs up to the porch. What's that? Richard pointed to an iron chain hanging from the upper part of the house. The bell would be my guess, said Fantasy. Go on, lad, ring it. Adventure was too short to reach the chain. Richard grabbed hold of it and gave a clank. Clang, clang. From out of the upper shadows of the house, something fell down, splattering onto the porch. It was a hideous book creature. Richard and Adventure had the same reaction. Ah! They shrieked. The creature was as terrified as they were. It let out a blood-curdling scream, too. Although it wasn't a monster, it certainly wasn't pleasant to look at. Like Adventure and Fantasy, it was a living book, but this book was in pitiful shape. Its spine was twisted, and its face was hideous. The name Horror was scratched in red on its shredded cover. Adventure bravely stepped in front of Richard and drew his sword. Stand back, boy. I'll give this hunchback a taste of adventure. Sanctuary! Sanctuary! The horror book cried. He scrambled up the bell chain and hid behind the molding over the doorway. Come on down, you dog-eared scallywag! Adventure jabbed his sword up toward the hidden book. "Oh, put that thing away. You're frightening him," Fantasy said as she fluttered up to the top of the door. Come out wherever you are," Fantasy sang in her most motherly voice. A sad, childlike voice cut through the darkness. "No, I know why you screamed. It's because I'm horrible. I scared you." "Hey, do I look scared?" Fantasy was buffing her fingernails. "You're not scared?" Horror's crooked head rose above the opening. "Course not." She offered her hand. "Come on down." "Nuh-uh, no." Horror pointed down at Adventure. "He wants to hurt me." "Him?" Fantasy dismissed Adventure with a gesture. "That little guy can't hurt anybody but himself. Come on down." Horror studied Fantasy. He decided that she looked very friendly. "Okay," he said, stepping out onto the molding. He reached out and lost his balance. Down he went, screaming again. This time, Horror landed in Richard's arms. "Here, take him!" Richard held the book out to Fantasy. "I'm sorry, I scared you." Horror covered his dreadful-looking face with his twisted hands. "I'm so horrible," he moaned. Fantasy pinched Horror's cheek. "You must never judge a book by its cover." When he heard this, Horror smiled his horrible smile. "Look," said Fantasy. "He's smiling." "That's a smile?" Richard sounded doubtful. All right, tea time's over." Adventure was getting impatient. "Let's start navigating this here house." Horror leapt out of Richard's arms and ran up to the house. Pressing up against the door, he blocked the way. "No, you can't go in there." "And why not?" asked Adventure. "It's scary inside." "Ha! I ain't afraid of nothing." Adventure puffed out his chest and slashed his sword through the air. Horror turned to Richard. I'm afraid." "Of what?" Richard was beginning to feel sympathetic towards this book. For once, somebody seemed to be just as afraid as he was. Horror began to list his fears as he pointed one by one to his crooked, triple-jointed fingers. "I'm afraid of the dark, dentists, butterflies, cucumbers." Cucumbers? That's one Richard hadn't thought of. "I know just how you feel," he said. "Horror always has sad endings," Horror stated glumly as he twisted his foot and rocked back and forth just like a kid. Fantasy hugged Horror tightly. Now, she reassured him. "I come from a world of happy endings. Why don't you come with us?" "Yeah, I bet you know the best way through the house." Richard was excited. "Through the house?" Horror looked frightened. "You can do it," Fantasy offered encouragement. Horror hesitated. "Okay." He grabbed the doorknob, looking back at them for reassurance, then pushed the door in. As the door opened, a sliver of light cut across the dark room. Rats scattered into the shadows. Horror entered cautiously, followed by Richard, Adventure, and Fantasy. "Hello? Anybody home?" Richard's voice filled the darkness. "Nevermore!" A croaky voice came out of the darkness, and a huge black raven swooped down over their heads. Richard and Horror panicked. They made a grab for the doorknob, which fell off and rolled across the floor. They watched the sparkling crystal knob roll slowly into the house. It stopped abruptly under the boot of a tall, silhouetted figure. "May I assist you in some way?" asked the figure. Adventure drew his sword, fearful that the mysterious speaker might be an enemy. But the figure stepped forward and turned up the flame on the gaslight fixture on the wall. The brighter light revealed a kind-looking middle-aged man. Fantasy primped her hair. Oh, hello there, Mr. Doctor Jekyll. Oh, you're a doctor. Fantasy was impressed. She twisted the bottom of her wand and out popped a lipstick. She quickly ran it over her lips. Well, sir, Richard started to explain, we did ring the bell, but... It's all my fault, Horace suddenly interrupted them. I was trying to help them find their way to the other side of the house. The other side. The phrase seemed to disturb the good doctor. He laid a hand on Richard's shoulder and led him deeper into the house. My boy, I derive no pleasure in telling you that you are in extreme danger. Danger? That was one of Richard's least favorite words. Even as we speak, forces of evil are lurking in this very room, waiting to strike. Evil? Now Richard was really nervous. All human beings are possessed of both good and evil. Richard looked suspiciously at his friends. They looked suspiciously at each other. But enough of that. Dr. Jekyll walked over to a table covered with beakers and test tubes. There he opened up an apothecary cabinet filled with more laboratory equipment. Anyone care for a drink? The doctor poured a red liquid into a glass and added a touch of powder. The mixture fizzed and threw off small plumes of vapor. The compound changed to a dark purple, then faded to a watery green. Richard looked at the drink and shook his head no. I'll have a go with ya, Doc. Adventure licked his lips and smoothed his mustache with his hook. The doctor plopped an olive into the drink and handed it to Richard, who handed it to Fantasy. She took a whiff. The smell made her eyeballs roll toward each other. She faked a smile and then turned to Adventure. Sure seems like your kind of drink, she said, handing him the glass. Horror watched the exchange with drooling anticipation. Can I have the olive, please? Horror begged shamelessly. Adventure shoved Horror away. Stand back, this is a man's drink. Just the olive, that's all. Horror yanked on Adventure's arm and the watery green liquid flew into the air. Richard and his friends watched it travel across the room in a graceful arc. It landed with a splash on the floor. Now look what you've done! Adventure pointed at the spilled drink. It was beginning to sizzle and burn its way through the hardwood floor. Richard whipped around to warn Dr. Jekyll not to touch his drink, but he was too late. The doctor began to stagger around the room, screaming and clutching his throat. He was gasping for breath. Richard knew that in a situation like this, you should call the poison hotline. He looked around for a phone, but he already knew that he wasn't likely to find one in a 19th century haunted house. The doctor's eyes turned a fiery red. He flung his glass into the fireplace, and the fire turned into a roaring inferno. Stumbling forward, he placed a hand on Richard's shoulder for support. Richard looked at the hand. It was changing, growing thick and hairy. Richard tore loose from his grasp. The doctor collapsed on the floor, writhing in pain, and covered his face in agony. Dr. Jekyll, are you all right? Fantasy asked. The doctor spun around on the floor like an animal and then finally struggled up to his feet. Fantasy fluttered back in shock. Now the doctor's face was wretched and wrinkled and mad with anger. My name is Mr. Hyde, he shouted. His eyes, which had once looked so kind, were glazed over with hate. Richard's knees were knocking together. I think we'll be going now, he said very politely. No one leaves this house alive! With one brutal sweep of his cane, Mr. Hyde shattered the delicate glass instruments in his laboratory. Like a wolf, toying with its dinner prey, he thwarted each and every attempt by Richard and his friends to escape. They were trapped. Horror leapt onto the fireplace mantel, then up to an iron chandelier. As Mr. Hyde advanced, a creaking noise sounded from above. The chandelier that Horror was standing on dropped from the ceiling, pushing Mr. Hyde right into the hole that the powerful drink had made in the floor. But as he fell, he grabbed the chandelier chain. It held tight, breaking his fall. Mr. Hyde laughed, a hideous-sounding laugh, and started to climb back up. The stairs, matey, ordered Adventure, pulling the boy along. Help, master! Everyone turned around when they heard Horror's pitiful cry. The poor book was caught in the chandelier chain. Horror looked like a poor trapped animal begging for mercy. Richard wanted to help, but he was too scared to move. To his alarm, the weight of Mr. Hyde was dragging the chandelier toward the hole in the floor. Don't leave me, Master, Horror cried. Sanctuary! Sanctuary! You've got to help him, Fantasy pleaded with Richard. When he didn't do anything, she flew back to help Horror herself. Pulling her see-through wings over her eyes for safety, she ignited the end of her wand like a blowtorch and set to work cutting through the chain. She succeeded in freeing Horror just as Mr. Hyde's head poked up into the room. The minute that Horror jumped off, the chandelier slid across the floor like a hockey puck and disappeared down the hall. Ah! Hyde roared in defeat. Let's get out of here! Fantasy and Adventure led the way to the stairs. Richard felt bad. He had proved to be useless. Horror moved over and tried to comfort him. It's okay, Master. I'd have been twice as scared as you. Gently, Horror took Richard's hand and led him to the stairway. One set of stairs led up, and another one went to a lower floor. Adventure smoothed his mustache with his hook while he considered the options. Not having a clue, he turned to Horror. Which way is it? This way, Horror pointed down. At the bottom of the stairs, a blood-red glow began to pulsate. They heard what sounded like a loud, steady heartbeat. Horror immediately pointed in the opposite direction, up. He scrambled up the stairs as fast as his crooked feet could climb. The staircase seemed to twist and turn forever. The higher they climbed, the darker and scarier it got. After a while, the stone walls began to turn into rows of books. Richard reached out to touch one, but his hand passed right through it. Where are we? Richard didn't think he liked this new place. Moans, groans, clanking chains, the sound of a haunting filled the air. Ghostly book characters circled overhead. Jacob Marley, King Hamlet, Dracula. All the dead spirits of horror fiction flew by, then disappeared into thin air. Richard rushed up the stairs, brushing ghosts away as if they were cobwebs. When he finally reached the top, he saw a long hallway with different colored doors on each side. They seemed to present an endless number of choices. Which door? Richard asked desperately. Horror looked confused. The blue door? No. The yellow door? No. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, he said, pointing at each door in turn. Adventure had had enough. Out of my way, he said, pushing Horror aside. He reached for a doorknob. No, not that one, Horror screamed, but he was too late. Adventure had yanked open the white door. Swoosh! A razor-sharp pendulum swung out from the room, nearly turning Adventure into a 2-volume set. Adventure shut the door in a hurry. Now it was Fantasy's turn. Always trust a woman's intuition, she said, choosing the pink door. She peeked in. Out came a gruesome-looking hand. It grabbed her by the throat and dragged her in. Richard, Horror, and Adventure hurried up to the door. They could hear from inside the sound of blood-curdling screams and noises that sounded like limbs being ripped apart. Just as they couldn't stand it anymore, the door swung open. Fantasy fluttered out, primping her hair. She slammed the door shut with her behind and muttered, "What a lightweight." Horror decided to try the black door. "Ah!" he screamed and slammed the door shut, terrified. "What is it?" Richard stammered. "It's so dark in there," Horror whimpered. "No nightlight." "Get in there!" Adventure whipped open the door and pushed Horror in. The room was dim and cold, and it reeked of formaldehyde. Richard recognized the smell from his biology class, where they had used the chemical stuff to preserve dead things. In the middle of the room stood a table covered with ancient-looking laboratory equipment and jars filled with pickled body parts. Nearby, a huge sheet covered a long stone slab. "Up there!" Fantasy pointed her wand in the direction of an overhead trapdoor. "That looks like a way out." A narrow stone staircase led up to the door. Unfortunately, the staircase was at the other end of the room. They would have to walk past the sheet-covered slab. "Shh!" Fantasy raised her wand to her lips. Taking the lead, Adventure drew out his sword and clopped as quietly as he could past the slab. Horror and Richard were bringing up the rear. All at once, they heard a low groan. Richard turned nervously to Horror. I hope that was your stomach. I don't have a stomach, Horror replied. Ugh. There came the scary groan again. Then the slab rotated forward. The sheets slithered down to the floor. Richard in horror discovered that they were standing next to 8 feet of stitched and rotting flesh. Oh, what's that? Richard whispered. Horror stood up on the tips of his toes to get a better look. It's either my Uncle Louis or the Frankenstein monster. Frankenstein! Richard shouted. The monster's eyelids flew open. Its nostrils flared as it produced another horrible groan. Richard in horror screamed, dashing for the stairs, but the monster lunged forward and grabbed Richard by the shirt. Let me go! The boy struggled, but the monster was slowly dragging him back. The rope, lad! Look to the rope! Adventure called down from the stairs. Richard looked up and discovered a rope that secured a hanging platform of electrical equipment high above the room. He jumped up and grabbed it. Adventure cut the rope at the other end with his sword, and the platform plunged to the floor, shooting Richard up out of the monster's grasp. Frustrated and angry, the monster was thrashing back and forth. Thanks to the rope, Richard was now up to the trapdoor where he joined his friends. Together, they pushed the trapdoor open and scrambled to an outside deck at the very top of the tower. A gargoyle statue held a torch that lighted up the stone wall encircling the deck. Beyond, there was nothing but darkness. This way, mateys! Adventure jumped up onto the wall and started to climb down the other side. Horror followed right behind him. Richard looked over the wall into a deep, dark unknown. No way, he objected. Honey, you gotta go. Fantasy flew over Richard on her way down. In spite of his terrible fear, he finally decided to follow his friend. He was doing okay until one of the stones under his foot slipped. He managed to grab hold of a water spout, but how long could he hang on? The books watched Richard from a ledge below. Master needs help, Horror said, worried. Help ain't what that boy needs, Adventure countered. Oh, you're the expert? Fantasy said as she started to fly up to help Richard. Adventure stopped her. Leave him be. It's time he started finding his own way. Richard's arms were getting tired. The vine, boy! Grab the vine! Adventure pointed with his sword toward the vine growing on the wall next to Richard. The boy reached out and grabbed it. But as soon as he let go of the water spout, the vine snapped off the wall. Richard shut his eyes and swung down like Tarzan, letting out a much, much louder yell than Tarzan ever made. Fortunately, the vine deposited him safely onto the ledge right beside his friends. Examining himself for broken bones, Richard was amazed to find that he was all right. Wow! He exclaimed. He had made it all by himself. Do you smell it? Breathe it in, mates. Adventure took a deep breath and pointed his sword out into the darkness. There in the distance, the exit sign faintly glowed. The exit! The exit! Horror cheered. Just then the sun began to rise, revealing a vast and beautiful ocean. It warmed the sandy tropical beach, the tall palm trees, and the high jagged cliffs. Adventure boldly thrust his chin out and raised his trusty sword. There it be, the land of adventure! And that's the end of chapter 2.